I talk to politicians, I don't geek out. For some reason, it's my life. I deal with politicians, set with presidents and mayors, even Lori Lightfoot, who I like. Although we probably disagree on everything, I don't geek out. But, listening to me geek out might be too much for you if you can't handle it. But our guest is none other than George R.R. Martin, the author of the series of books upon which the worldwide hit Game of Thrones was made. Martin was here in Chicago in 1967, a student at Northwestern University. At a time when the snow fell so heavily and so hard and never stopped falling and falling, eventually there were trenches where people walked, and the sides of the trenches grew and grew into solid ice, the seeds of the great ice wall between Westeros and the Wildings. So we'll talk to George R.R. Martin as he comes to Chicago to win awards. Joining me right now is Jeff Carlin, co-host here and executive producer of The Rokon Show with Anna Devolantis on WGN. And me, I'm John Cass, husband, father, syndicated columnist for the Chicago Tribune, and a member of its editorial board. And you know where you are? You're in that place where there's liars all about, and they're all better than you. You're on the Chicago Way on WGN+.
Dragons do not do well in captivity.
How do you know this?
That's what I do. I drink and I know things.
Look, the Chicago Way is a deep cultural phenomenon.
In a tower by the river, there lived a man. There was a man who took a stand with pen and paper in his hand, defeating foes in every ward with a pen more mighty than the sword. No escape from his ink lasso in a tower by the river, Castle.
Here's how you get him. He pulls a knife, you pull a gun. He sends one of yours to the hospital, you send one of his to the morgue. That's the Chicago way.
Mr. Martin.
Hi there.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
So we won't take up too much of your time. I just write 4 columns a week, but I don't have millions of people telling me how to do it. So,
well, yes, there is that. And how fast to do it.
Yeah, right, exactly.
You probably have an editor who likes you to meet your deadlines.
Yeah, but I'm not going to bother you with that. I don't want to play editor. We're speaking to a fellow who went to college in Chicago at Northwestern in the late 60s and dealt with a big snowstorm and told me about it, and I thought it was perfect as an explanation for why is there that huge wall of ice in his novels.
I remember that snowstorm very well.
We're speaking to George R.R. Martin, the author of, I guess people who just watch TV and don't read books would say Game of Thrones, but he's an amazing writer in his own right who's done many, many things, and you're working on the next book to come out in the saga of Fire and Ice, right?
That's right, The Winds of Winter, Volume 6 overall, which of course is years late, but I am still working on it.
I'm not telling you when to write or how to write. One thing when we first got you on the phone, I asked you off the mic, what is it like to be told how to write and what you should write by millions and millions of fans, some of whom don't even give you their name on Reddit? How does that feel? It's got to be.
Well, it's a mixed blessing, let us say. Most writers, including myself at certain points in my career, struggle to get noticed. Your biggest danger is obscurity. Your books come out and no one pays much attention to them. If you get 1 or 2 reviews, it's great. But then you reach the other side of the spectrum where I do indeed have millions of people waiting for this book to come out, which is very gratifying on one thing, but some of them are extremely impatient, and some of them are full of their own ideas about the fates of the various characters. I'm glad that they can get so emotionally involved with these characters, but sometimes I wish I yearn for the days when I could just work in quiet obscurity, and then when I was finished a book, I would say, look, here it is, it's a book. Enjoy it or not, as you like. But those days are gone for me, I'm afraid. So this is the reality of my life now.
Mr. Martin, you don't know me. We never met before, but I'm a huge fan, and I'm John Cass's producing partner and working partner here on the podcast. And John is a light right now. He's grinning ear to ear, so I just wanted people who are listening, because it's a podcast.
I'm nerdtastic right now.
He's having a nerd overload, and I am too. I really wanted to ask you, I love the idea, and I always imagine this when I'm reading the books or even watching something on TV, but the idea that when you're writing for this, I know you have a really long process with researching and outlining and kind of drawing all the connections together, but I got to imagine that there are times at night when you're falling asleep and all of a sudden you drift off into your own world. Do you wake up and have to, I got to write that down, or like just things hit you on your own, entering this world that you're creating? That's got to be such a cool, unique space, because as much of us do it based on what you write, it's actually living inside of you. I mean, I love that concept. Can you speak a little bit about how that process works for you?
Well, it's interesting that you would bring up falling to sleep. That's not something I often talked about, but it is a period where if my writing is going well and I'm really in Westeros, it does haunt me like day and night. And one of the times that it's most common is when I go to bed at night. I'm lying there in bed, I'm waiting to go to sleep, the lights are out, and the scenes that I'm going to write tomorrow are in my head, or maybe the scenes I'm going to write next week, or maybe a scene from a different chapter. I don't know. I can't control it, but something starts filling my head, and the characters start coming alive, and I start hearing snatches of dialogue, and I drift to sleep with Westeros and Ice and Fire in my head, haunting me as it will. Also, sometimes other times that happens. I know you're calling from Chicago. I started writing and selling my earliest science fiction stories when I was still living in Chicago. I lived in Uptown, but I was a Vista volunteer, and I worked down in the Loop. And I would take the L every day to work. And it's not the most exciting ride in the world, so I would sit there sort of staring out the window as it went by, and stories would fill my head, not necessarily the things that I was seeing on the rooftops of Chicago, but other planets and imaginary realms and all of that. So it's almost a case where you're almost zoning out. You're writing on an L and it's boring, or you're drifting to sleep and you're not quite asleep yet, but you're not awake yet either, and then this stuff comes to you. Of course, what's happened in my life recently is that there's so much else now. I mean, there's the success of the show and the success of other things has injected a lot of other aspects into my life. So sometimes I lie in bed at night and I'm not thinking about me, even though I may want to be thinking about Westeros. I'm not thinking about Westeros. I'm thinking about some other problem that's having something that's one of the other shows I'm involved with, or a deadline or an anthology I'm editing, or something that's happening with the nonprofit organization that I started. All of these other things are filling my head, and that is one of the things that's delayed me. I really have to get wins done. I have to sort of put myself in a state where I'm not being distracted by other stuff, and that period of time at night is filled with the voices of Tyrion Lannister and Arya Stark and the other fictional characters who kind of live inside of me.
As opposed to riding on the L, zoning out, and some old lady's telling a gruesome story to a little boy, and there you hear the voice of old Nan. But we are speaking to George R.R. Martin. He is going to be honored on October 10th at the Chicago Public Library Foundation with the Carl Sandburg Literary Award. He will be interviewed on stage by NPR's Scott Simon, and then the next day he will be at an event at the Chicago Humanities Festival Library Foundation at the Symphony Center, where his fellow Sandburg Award honoree Eve Ensler will interview him. Mr. Martin, I can't think that I could even reach those levels of interviewer, but I remember having lunch with you at Northwestern a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, and you were complaining about all the demands on your time. And you mentioned a story about what it was like when you were a young student in Chicago with the snow falling, and it fell, and it fell.
My freshman year at Northwestern, yeah. Yeah, I was 19,
67.
what year would it have been? 67, yeah. A gigantic snowstorm. I was walking back from class when it started, and I could barely find my dormitory. I mean, it was just a blinding snowstorm. I felt like I was in the Antarctic. You know, you're just blinded by the snow coming there. You see distant lights, and you don't know what building it is anymore because you've lost track of how far you've come. Not only that, but after that snowstorm, I think we got 23 inches or something like that.
More, yeah.
It got real cold, and it didn't melt for a long time. So for a couple of weeks, I mean, the snow was higher than the first floor windows. So, you know, they dug trenches like in World War II, World War I, rather. Trenches meeting other trenches. You know, to go to class, you'd be wandering around this white trench. You couldn't see to either side of you. The walls would be over your head. But they put up little signs, you know, this way to this dormitory, this way to this hall, and you go through that. The whole world was transformed for about 2 weeks there. It was pretty amazing.
So is that the basis or the, I don't know, mind candy seed, whatever you want to call it, for the Great Wall?
You know, it may have been buried in my subconscious somewhere. It's not a direct influence. You know, the direct inspiration for the wall was 1981 when I visited Hadrian's Wall in between England and Scotland. And I stood on that wall and tried to imagine what it was like to be a Roman legionary stationed on a wall at the end of the world. And, you know, another decade later when I started to write Game of Thrones, those feelings came back to me. But the memory of that northwestern snowstorm is probably still there in my subconscious somewhere. Sometimes you never know where these scenes are coming from. But everything that you experience or hear or do in your life becomes grist for the mill.
Most writers, if they're known, they become a personality, but that's not the real person that they are. And then they also have the personality that drives the writing, which may be different. I wonder how you balance all that push and pull with all the demands on your time and all the pressure to continue to write books. How do you balance that?
Well, some people would say poorly, since the book is late. I don't know. You know, I'm making it up as I go along. It's not something that I ever really expected to happen. Of course, you always hope that your books will be successful, that they'll sell well. And when you're connected with a TV show, you expect or hope that it'll be, you know, picked up, that it'll be a hit, that it'll win a few awards. But, you know, the scale of success of Game of Thrones has exceeded anyone's expectations, and it does tend to take a lot of time, take a lot of your emotional energy, and so forth. But it's exciting. Sometimes it's frustrating. You just have to deal with it one day at a time and do the best you can, and that's what I'm trying to do. I do sometimes wish it had happened to me, 30 years ago, rather than happening to me at my age, because it does kind of wear me out sometimes. Unsurprisingly, since I'm 70, I don't have the energy I did when I was 30 or 40, but I still have a fair amount of energy, and I still get a fair amount done.
And sir, I was wondering, the idea of most great authors, you always hear them, they have stories about, and you're being honored by a couple of library associations here in Chicago coming up. And there's the idea of that first place where you got to reading your favorite book, or that one library you went to as a kid. Do you have a memory that you think about when you sit down, or you think about, where you've come from as a reader, transitioning into obviously a magnificent author? Do you ever think about that retrospectively to where you are now?
Oh, yeah, I all the time. And sometimes I wonder how I got there. For me, I grew up in Bayonne, New Jersey, a blue-collar town outside of New York City. We had no bookstores, not a bookstore in the entire town. When I bought books, they were cheap paperbacks that I bought off a spinner rack at a candy store, bodega type place, a few blocks from me, and the spinner rack was right next to the comic books. It was also a library. It was a branch library on 5th Street that was very close to me, and it was like an old storefront. I don't know what it had been originally, but it had the big plate glass windows in front. Not an old library. It had a delicatessen on one side of it and a pet store on the other, and I patronized all three of them. The delicatessen is still there, as a matter of fact. But so that branch library, of course, I was a big science fiction and fantasy fan. They didn't have a huge selection of science fiction and fantasy fan. They had a few, and I think I read all of them over the years. I would go in and, take out a couple books. I think limited you to like 2 at a time and read those and bring them back and get a couple more. So those are the only hardcover books I could see, of course, because the only books I could afford to buy were the 35-cent paperbacks off the spinner rack.
I have to go a little Game of Thrones nerd on you, okay? Just
Sure.
Bear with me, all right? Are you relieved that the show is over now?
I have mixed feelings about that. There was a period where the show caught and passed me, and I hadn't anticipated that happening. So there was a tremendous amount of stress on me a few years ago when that was about to happen, but it hadn't happened yet, and I was desperately trying to finish wins and stay ahead. And it didn't work. The amount of stress that was on me at that time slowed me down rather than speeding me up. Now that the show is over, any stress in that regard is done. But, of course, we have 5 successor shows in various stages of development, and one of them has just finished shooting in Northern Ireland, their pilot episode. Another one is very close to getting a pilot order. So I'm involved with those as well. So Game of Thrones, that particular story, that particular show may be over on TV, but it's not over for me. I still have these 2 more books to write. And there's other stories in the world of Westeros, which is a entire world, and I'm still deeply involved with those. So believe me, there's still plenty to keep me busy.
What about the hype leading up to last season on the show? And again, I'm not trying to criticize what they call showrunners now, although I find that to be an odd term. It was clear that they were really good at interpreting what you had written. And then when they passed you in terms of time, it seemed lost to me compared to...
I'm not going to comment on that. I think...
I just thought it was very difficult.
There's
they were in
2
a
different
difficult
forms
position.
of the same story, and everybody can, when I finish my book, read them. But other than that, that's not something I want to get into.
Well, I would like to talk to you about the origin stories that you're working on now. You referenced the pilot that was just made and another that's going to be made. The First Men, that whole business, you have another world, like another several millennia to deal with, even before you get to the King's Landing in Westeros.
It's Jane Goldman's show, which doesn't have an official title yet, is set 5,000 years before Game of Thrones. So it's the same world, but it's a much older version of the world. I mean, think back 5,000 years from where we are today. You'd be talking about 3,000 BC. A lot of things can change in 5,000 years. But again, there's really not much I can say about the pilots and all that. So
no, I'm not asking for. I'm not asking you to give me a hint of what you're doing. I'm more interested in the last question, the nature of why this saga is so important to so many people. I mean, there are whole industries of bloggers and podcast people depending on you in a way that and making a living on you in a way that hadn't been conceived before. But I'm just wondering, is it nostalgia of the West for the Holy Roman Empire and before, in the times of John Marshall and great knights, or is it something else?
Well, I think there is something that resonates about medieval period. I mean, certainly I've always been fascinated by it. I can't speak for everyone, but it was a period in our history of great contrasts. I mean, it was the Dark Ages in one sense. There was a lot of ignorance. There was a lot of poverty. People died very young. The wars were constant. A very kind of dark time. But against that, you had the ideals of chivalry and these knights in shining armor who took vows to defend the weak, protect the innocent, defend women. Very, very noble vows. There were these high ideals and a very gritty reality. And out of that extreme contrast comes conflict and comes drama. And that's the kind of stuff that, of course, fuels fiction and fuels television and film. You want the sharp blacks and whites, the ups and downs, the mountains and the valleys. Not everything just sort of gray and ordinary. And I think the Middle Ages appeals to us for that reason. And I'm certainly not the only one. I mean, mine is a medieval fantasy, but most of the great fantasies also draw on the Middle Ages to a greater or lesser degree, from J.R. Tolkien to, Robert Jordan, Joe Abercrombie, Mark Lawrence, everybody who's writing epic fantasy these days is mostly drawing on the same period, the Middle Ages, even in fantasy world.
And I think one of the things we've always talked about on this, when we talk, John and I and some of the other people who we have who are huge fans of yours, about the idea that everybody, there's somebody who every person reading can akin themselves to or feel like they really connect to, because it is so multi-layered, stratospherically of culture. And I love that about them. And speaking of great culture, you're going to be in Chicago. Anything you look forward to doing or try to squeeze in? Is there a favorite diner or a restaurant or something you love to get in while you're here?
Sure. I always love to get down to Greektown and have some of the Greek food. Chicago has some of the best Greek food in the world. And I'm going to go back to Northwestern and visit folks up there as well.
One last thing before we break, and if I don't do this, I can't see my sons, okay, because they've been peppering me, and I hope you can forgive me, but they've been peppering me. You must listen to the Great Northern Conspiracy. You must understand that he outlines, and you have to think about the Umbers and the division between the Umbers and others. Can you please...
your son has it bad.
Yes, they do have it bad, both twins, but can you please tell us about the Great Northern Conspiracy, just so I could go home and say, Dad is really cool. I interview, presidents, but that's okay. I'm interviewing George R. R. Martin. That's a different deal altogether.
I'm sorry, but I do not comment on these fan theories. I know there are a million of them. Okay. Some of them are out there, and some of them are true, and some of them are false. But nope, no comment from this end.
Mr. Martin, thank you very much for being here. And we look forward to it, and I hope we don't have another snowstorm that will bring another great wall of ice.
Hopefully not in October. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Great. Good talking to you guys.
Good talking to you. And that was George R. R. Martin. Now I can actually have dinner with my children. I asked the Great Northern Conspiracy.
You did it.
With the Umbers.
Who owns the North? We do! Who owns the North? We do! Show me!
Whoa. George Martin got a little testy with us, didn't he?
Yeah, a little bit. But, to be expected. He's got to protect his craft.
Protect his craft, but I mean, at least I think I got it out that the last season was kind of crappy.
Maybe.
Well, you have to have writers, and those guys are good producers, but they're not writers. No offense to producers. We have the best one in the world, but I mean, and they're good writers. They're writing the Star Wars saga, the new one, which I won't see because they ruined the last season of Game of Thrones. But he was upset.
He was. He was a little testy there.
I'm not going to talk about this. Right?
Yeah.
I kind of like that because, we have to ask the questions even of mythic figures like George R. R. Martin. You got to ask him. That's journalism. That's what we do. Even while we're geeking out and having a nerdgasm or whatever Will Lee would have called it. But here's the thing. Did you like what you heard? Consider some of the guests. Joe Mansueto of the Chicago Fire, Andy McCarthy, National Review, Charlie Lipson, Professor Charles Lipson of the University of Chicago, Molly Hemingway of The Federalist and author of that book on Kavanaugh, and so many others. You don't hear long-form interviews of important people elsewhere, but you hear it here. So we need you to go online. Tell your friends about this podcast. Tell them you listen. Get them to listen. Find us on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, wherever you find your free podcast. Subscribe free. And if it's on iTunes, write us a kick-ass 5-star review. You know why? Because that's the Chicago way, too. And I won't give your brother a job in the Department of Plumbing, but I will thank you. And I will always be your loyal servant and kiss your hand. For George R. R. Martin, author of the worldwide best-selling series, A Song of Ice and Fire, that is the basis for the Game of Thrones show on HBO. And for Jeff Carlin, WGN, executive producer of the Rokon Show with Anna Devlantis, and my good friend. And when you look at Jeff, a burly ginger with a beard, you can see him in black standing on that wall, looking out, protector of Westeros, the man, the shield of the realm. And me, I have legs that are probably as short as Tyrion Lannister's. They fit into a shopping bag, although people who don't know me think I'm 7 feet tall with fire bolts coming out of my behind. I'm John Kass, husband, father, columnist for the Chicago Tribune, member of its editorial board, and you've been on The Chicago Way on WGN+.